1965, Ferdinand Marcos was elected as the 10th president of the Philippines. During Marcos's first term, he was able to accomplish many goals that contributed to the development of the Philippines, through infrastructure projects and increased rice production that furthered economic growth. Because of a successful 4 years, Marcos was re-elected in 1969. Despite his achievements in the first term, his second term was shadowed by fraud and corruption. His family, especially his wife Imelda, began using the government's funds for its personal gain. This greatly contributed to the weakening economy and the rising poverty rates. Infuriated with his corrupt actions, people began to oppose him in a series of violent protests. Political leaders started to challenge Marcos as well. A prominent figure who emerged from this movement was Benigno Ninoy Aquino. In 1967, Aquino won the seat for senator as a member of the Liberal Party, uncovering scandals involving the Marcos administration. In retaliation, Marcos tried vigorously to unseat Aquino from the Senate by filing cases that besmirched Aquino. However, Aquino continued to increase in popularity with speeches that furthered his cause. The Liberal Party placed its faith in him as the one who could unite all the political parties against Marcos's regime. Threatened by the chaotic demonstrations, the growing power of the Liberal Party, and his term coming to an end, Marcos proclaimed martial law in September 1972. Martial law allowed Marcos to abuse military power. With the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, opposing politicians and student activists were jailed. Prisoners experienced various methods of torture, such as electrocution, strangulation, Russian roulette, and burning. The emotional and physical pain broke many people's spirits, and some even died. Additionally, Marcos embezzled millions of the country's money by putting his relatives and friends in political positions, which he used for his personal advantage. He also shut down and controlled media organizations, taking away the people's right to freedom of speech and press. A year later, Marcos enacted a new constitution, which legitimized his total control. Through these actions, democracy had been destroyed, and those who had the courage to speak against him were silenced. Aquino was one of the first to be arrested under martial law, but continued to defy Marcos despite his imprisonment, through essays that criticized the Marcos administration. After 7 years of his sentence, he was permitted to receive a heart operation in America to treat serious heart complications. Martial law remained for 9 years until 1981, when Marcos held elections. He won, primarily because of election fraud, and began his 6-year-long third term. Although martial law had been lifted, Marcos still held absolute authority, and people continued to live in constant fear and uncertainty. Despite the government's efforts to stop him, Aquino decided that it was time to return to his home country after 3 years in America.
But I cannot be petrified by inaction or fear of assassination and therefore stay in a corner. I have to suffer with my people. I have to lead them.
The Filipino is worth dying for, he said. With an illegal passport, he headed to the Philippines, even though it could cost him his life. On August 21, 1983, people gathered at the Manila International Airport for Aquino's arrival, which was decorated with yellow ribbons to show their welcome. As he exited the plane and went down the stairs, accompanied by military personnel, a gunshot fired and hit Aquino in the head. He fell to the ground and died. The people's voice, the people's only hope of liberation, was gone. During his funeral procession, millions of adoring supporters attended, united in their grief for Aquino. People believed Marcos had been involved in the assassination. Aquino's death and sacrifice stirred the hearts of the Filipinos to fight for change, giving them the courage they had been lacking for years. The nation was awakened by that deafening shock. Everyone from middle-class workers to businessmen to students came out to rally and cry for justice. Even though Aquino had died, his vision of restoring democracy would continue through the people. Corazon Aquino, the wife of Benigno Aquino, became the symbol of opposition. As a major victim of Marcos's regime, she advocated for change by leading rallies and emerged as a unifier of the people. With the increasing dissent, the downfall of the economy, and an international reputation at risk, Marcos had to take action in order to secure his power. On November 3, 1985, he declared a snap election to be held on February 7, 1986. Aquino was chosen as a candidate to represent the opposing parties. At first, she was reluctant to run because she had no political experience. However, after acquiring a petition with 1.2 million signatures supporting her as president, Aquino made her decision to run along with Salvador Laurel. With only 60 days to campaign, Aquino spread her democratic mission throughout the entire country. Yellow, once used to welcome Benigno Aquino, had evolved into a symbol of protest and was worn by all her supporters. They held up the letter L with their hands, which stood for laban, the Filipino word for fight. On the day of the snap election, there were widespread incidents of cheating and violence. Marcos's henchmen intimidated others into voting for him and stole ballot boxes. They bribed, maimed, and even killed voters. To ensure an honest election, many volunteers risked their lives to protect the ballot boxes. Computer workers discovered inconsistencies in the vote count and walked out in protest. On February 15th, the government declared Marcos the winner. Enraged, the people had reached their breaking point. The Catholic bishops of the Philippines issued a statement condemning the rigged election, and Aquino led a rally urging for civil disobedience and boycott. During the first hours of February 22, 1986, rebels led by Juan Ponce Enrile and Fidel Ramos formed a plan to overthrow Marcos's regime. Together, they announced their opposition toward Marcos and their support for Aquino. At this point, the government started issuing arrest warrants for the military rebel leaders. James Cardinal Sin, the Archbishop of Manila, called upon the Filipino people, urging them to take a stand against Marcos by protecting the leaders. Marcos warned them to stop this stupidity, to which Enrile answered defiantly, "Your time is up." The revolution had begun. With a revived spirit, thousands of Filipinos heeded the Cardinal's message and gathered on Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, regardless of differences among them spanning from age to socioeconomic status. They congregated outside of the two rebel camps, Camp Crame and Camp Aguinaldo. Despite the threatening presence of Marcos's military, it was a joyous and supportive environment.
People were just standing there, singing, offering flowers, sharing food. There's people around you, you don't know them, but you pray together. There's unity, and there was no violence at all.
Soldiers began to resign because they couldn't bear to attack unarmed citizens. Soon after, Marcos sent tanks to capture the defectors. However, the protesters ensured the protection of the military and the camps.
The people were holding hands, and they were really creating a human barrier for the tanks, for the soldiers.
And then you see people not armed, willing to be at the front lines of bases, military bases, just so that they won't be attacked.
Although hundreds of thousands flooded the streets of EDSA, Marcos stood his ground and went on government-controlled Channel 4 to declare that he would not step down. He was interrupted by rebels who captured the station. They announced,
"Channel 4 is on the air again to serve the people."
By the end of the day, 80% of Marcos's armed forces had defected and joined the protests on the street. Later in the morning, Aquino was inaugurated as president at Club Filipino. In retaliation, Marcos held an inauguration at Malacanang Palace. But the loss of military support and civil unrest accumulated as crowds swelled to 2 million people. At midnight on February 26th, Marcos and his family fled to Hawaii. When news of the departure reached civilians, they burst into celebration. After 20 long years under a dictator, the people were free at last. As the new president of the Philippines, Aquino brought back democracy, restoring the liberties of the people and limiting executive branch powers. She became known as the icon of Philippine democracy. United in purpose, the young, the old, the rich, the poor, the church, the military, fought for freedom and democracy as one. This event became known as the People Power Revolution, for change could have only been enacted through the overwhelming amount of people who stood valiantly on the streets of EDSA. Non-violent revolutions in multiple countries around the globe were inspired by this movement, many of which have left a lasting impact on the world today. The Filipinos' example showed humanity the power of taking a stand, peacefully and courageously.
You saw a nation armed with courage and integrity stand fast by democracy against threats and corruption. You saw a people so committed to the ways of democracy that they were prepared to give their lives for its pale imitation. At the end of the day, I announce the people's victory.